Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Kelly. My name is Kelly. So today we are going to do a book club style book chat. Now, I have done book videos in the past. Usually when I do book videos, I do something where I feature a lot of different books that I have recently read. But today we are going to just talk about one book. And that book is called The Women by Kristin Hannah. This is the first book that I have ever read by Kristin Hannah. And I know that it's been kind of going around on social media a little bit in the last little while. So I thought I would give it a try. I don't ordinarily read books that I hear a lot about on social media. I personally find I tend to not like those books. I find that they tend to be a little overhyped. So let's talk about The Women. I will give you, we'll talk about it, and then at the end of the video, I will let you know what I thought about the book. So fair warning, if you have not read this book, just know that I am going to talk about the entire plot of the book. So maybe save this video until after you have read it, and then come back and watch it after that. So let's dive in and talk about it. So The Women is a story about Frankie McGrath. She is a young woman who is from kind of like a well-to-do family in California. The type of family that has a good reputation in the community. They go to the country club, that sort of thing. And the story takes place in the latter part of the 1960s, during the time when the Vietnam War is really kind of going on. And so the story opens with a party that her family is giving for her older brother, who has enlisted in the Navy to go to Vietnam, and he's just about to go to Vietnam. So her family is also kind of like a Navy family. And so her family has kind of like this long history of people who have gone and fought in different wars in the Navy. So her brother Finley is just about to go to Vietnam, and they're throwing kind of a going away party for him. And at this party, so she's really close to her brother, and at this party, she, one of her brother's friends, is there, and she goes into her father's den. Her father's got an office or a den where there's all these kind of like a wall of honor of people who have fought in different wars and who have kind of served their country. And it's kind of like a wall of heroes is what they call it. And her brother's friend meets her in there and just kind of imparts some knowledge that kind of sits in the back of her mind that, yes, like these people are heroes, but women can be heroes as well. And so that really kind of sticks with her. So I'm mentioning it because it's quite important kind of as we go along the line in the story. And so they have this party. She says goodbye to her brother. And I think at this time, a lot of people weren't really aware of what was really happening in Vietnam and in the Vietnam War. And so I think they were really idealistic that, okay, he's going to go there. He's going to be this hero. He's going to come home. Everything's going to be great. So Frankie goes to school and she becomes a nurse, and she gets a job in a local hospital. But because she's so new, they kind of start her at the very bottom, and she gets the night shift, and she is just kind of doing menial things, even though she graduated at the top of her class. But she's really anxious to kind of get in there and, just kind of like do a good job and find where she belongs. And during this time, she kind of gets it into her head that she also wants to enlist in the Navy as a nurse and go over to Vietnam and serve in the Vietnam War because her brother is there. And so that's what she decides she wants to do. So one day she goes to the Navy office, but they won't take her because she doesn't have enough experience in being a nurse. So she goes to the Marines. I think it's the Marines, and they also won't take her. It could either be the Marines or the Air Force. I can't quite remember. But she goes to another branch of the military and they won't take her as well. So then she decides to go to the Army. And the Army are like, yes, we'll take you. We will send you out for basic training immediately, and we will ship you off. So she goes ahead and she enlists. And when she goes home, she thinks that her parents are going to be very excited and they are going to be very, very proud of her. But of course, instead, they're in a panic and they're very upset and they're like, how could you do this? Because at this time you have to understand, or you have to remember, even though I wasn't alive in the 60s, but it was still a time of that kind of innocence where a woman was kind of expected to, and I think especially coming from where she did in her family, a young woman was expected to maybe go to school, find a job until she's able to get a husband, and then marry and have a husband and a family and go to the country club. And that's kind of what she was expected to do. But no, she wanted to follow her brother, enlist in the Army, but they are really not happy with her and really not happy with the situation. But what's done is done, and she has to follow through with it. Just during this time, a little while after, they get somebody comes to the house and lets them know that her brother has been killed. His plane was shot down, something like that, and he has been killed. So, of course, this still reinforces, especially with her mother, the feeling of you have to try to get out of this, but of course she can't. So the time comes, she goes to basic training. She is determined to be the best nurse that she can be. And she really excels during her basic training time period. And so she thinks, okay, I've got this. This is going to be good. So the day comes when she gets shipped off to Vietnam, and she's dressed all nice and proper in her perfect Army uniform, and really kind of excited to go there. Like I said, once again, a lot of people didn't really realize what it meant. And so when she first gets there, of course, she's kind of thrown into, because it's an active war zone, she's really kind of thrown into all of the sights and the sounds of what is actually happening there. And nobody really cares that she's new. And so she has a little bit of a journey getting to where she finally winds up. But when she does get there, she meets these two girls who are also nurses, and they are living in the same, so they call it a hooch. It's not a tent, but it's like, you can Google what it looks like, and I'm sure if you've seen any movies that take place during the Vietnam War, you kind of know what it is. But anyway, it's her shelter, the area where they live, and they have their cots there. And anyway, so she gets put in a hooch with these other two nurses who really take her under their wing and really help her along when she first gets there. And she gets initially stationed to an evac hospital, which is it's not on the front lines, but at this evac hospital, they are getting a lot of course, the men who are, very injured, critically injured, missing limbs. They need quick operations, all of that kind of stuff. So she gets into that and just really starts to experience all of what it means to be a nurse in a war. So when she first gets there, she also meets this doctor named Jamie, and going through everything that they are experiencing, taking care of soldiers in a war and all of the traumatic things that they're doing and seeing, they kind of start to develop a little bit of a friendship and a little bit of a relationship. But her friends tell her, well, no, he's married. So for her being the type of young girl who was raised well, and at the time that she was, she just could not see herself going there and doing that, even though she starts to really develop feelings for him and feels like she is in love with him. But it's not to be, because she just doesn't want to let herself go there. So as the war goes on, she is really kind of like proving herself, and she's really becoming like a really great nurse in these kind of really terrible circumstances. And then at one point, Jamie does get injured, and like very critically injured. And she's taking care of him. I think he's in a coma, and they have to take him away. And the last thing that she sees is, he is flatlining and he is dead. And they take him away. And so she's really heartbroken. Also during this time, she is really starting to see that she's starting to question a lot of what the American government is really telling the people in the US. Like, she's seeing something different than what is actually being told to them. So in the US, like, the government is basically lying to everybody and saying everything's going great and we're winning this war and we're fighting against communism. But she's seeing something completely different. She's seeing men coming in every day with critical injuries and men dying, and even the Vietnamese people, they are even setting up clinics and going to villages to help Vietnamese people who have also been critically injured and sick, and because of what's happening with the war. So she starts to question all of that, as well as starting to see a little bit of or actually hearing a little bit of kind of the protests that are happening back in the US, with people that are starting to not really approve of what's going on. So while all of this is going on, she's kind of recovering from, the relationship that she had with Jamie. He's now gone. She also meets, at this point, she comes across her brother's friend. I forgot to tell you what his name was. So his name was Rye. So the young man who she met at her parents' place during her brother's going away party, she meets up with him again. And they kind of start a little bit of a relationship. But once again, she is told that, oh, well, he's engaged. So once again, here's another guy who's kind of out of the question. So that kind of happens. And during the course of her deployment, her two friends, so the two friends that she met who really helped her adjust to being there, the other two nurses, their names are Barb and Ethel. They eventually, their time comes up that they're finished their tour and they can go home. And it is now coming up to the year that Frankie can now go home. But she decides, I have found my place. I have found where I belong. I'm doing really good here. And she decides to sign up for a second tour, which would mean her being in Vietnam for another year. So she decides to do that. When she writes her parents, her mom is, no, like, you have to come home. Like, you can't do this. But no, she decides, like, this is what I'm meant to do. So she decides to stay. So just before she has to commence her second tour of duty, the Army makes her kind of go on an R&R for a week, and Rye decides to go with her. He decides to meet her there, and they go to Hawaii. And so they spend this nice week in Hawaii. When he gets there, he tells her that he has broken his engagement, so now he is free. And they have this great kind of week in Hawaii, this sort of like love affair. And so she decides that she is going to just go full force with this. And they have this great time. And during this time as well, Rye decides to sign up for another year because she's going to stay. So she gets back to Vietnam after this wonderful week in Hawaii with Rye. And, she's continuing to see terrible things that are happening. Her friends are writing her from the U.S., Barb and Ethel, who have gone back, kind of cluing her in a little bit to some of the things that are really happening in the U.S. They're kind of saying, it's not so great here for veterans, and there's a lot of protests, and people are really against what's happening, and the government is not really being honest with everything that is happening. So when she gets back to commence her second tour, they eventually send her from the evac hospital that she was currently working in to an area of Vietnam that is more on the front lines. And there, it's a lot more dangerous. And they're constantly having the power go out, and they have to help these men coming in, sometimes with no power, with bombs going off all around you, and just with like emergency lighting. And so this is kind of the conditions that she's trying to survive through. When her year is finally up, her second year, she's excited to go home. She's excited for her parents to kind of like be proud of her. Rye is going to be, his second tour is going to be up in another month or two. And so she's excited to get home to kind of like, so that they can start their life together. But when she gets home, it's not really what she kind of thinks it's going to be. And, people are like spitting on her and calling her names, and she can't really understand why, when all she felt like she was doing the right thing by going there. She was helping people. She was saving men's lives, but the American public are just not seeing it that way. And then when she gets home, so she doesn't tell her parents exactly when she's coming home. So when she gets home, they are kind of like not really what she's expecting. She's expecting them to welcome her home and be very proud of her. But they're very cold toward her. And their attitude is you just have to forget about it, move on with your life, forget that happened, and just continue on. So that's what she tries to do for a while. She does get a job as a nurse, and now she's expecting that with all of her experience in Vietnam as a nurse, that they will finally give her more interesting things to do. But they don't believe her. They don't believe that she went to Vietnam. They were just like, there were no women in Vietnam. So once again, she's stuck with just kind of like the bottom rung sort of things, like taking patients' temperatures and changing bedpans and that sort of thing. During this time as well, she starts to experience a lot of trauma and what we now know as PTSD from being in the war. Which obviously now we can understand that, right? From just kind of what you're experiencing and you're constantly being on guard. It's hard to kind of let that go, and it's kind of get out of it's hard to get out of that. But she starts to experience it. She starts to she's not sleeping very well. She's having really bad dreams. She's having night terrors. She's winding up, waking up on her bedroom floor. When she goes with her mother to like the country club, she's having these really angry outbursts because of whatever is happening in her mind. It's triggering really these traumatic things in her mind. And at points throughout the time when she goes home, she tries to get help for it. But everywhere she goes, even like the Veterans Affairs Office and different places like that, they just will tell her, these services are for veterans. And she's like, but I am a veteran. And they're like, no, there were no women in Vietnam. So they don't really believe that she really needs that help. So to kind of get her out of this a little bit, so she stays in contact with her friend Barb and Ethel. Barb lives in Atlanta, in the Georgia area, I think, and Ethel lives in Virginia. And so they're kind of communicating a little bit through letters and through phone calls. And so to kind of get her out of this, they suggest, well, you know, Rye is coming home soon. Why don't you plan a coming home party for him? And so she's like, okay, that's a great idea. So she looks up his father and she goes to visit him. And when she gets there, he shows her the letter that he received, that Rye was in fact shot down and he is dead. He is gone. So once again, just another traumatic loss for her. With losing her brother, losing Jamie, and now losing Rye. So this is just another traumatic experience for her. So at some point after this, she decides to go and kind of get out of California and live with her friend Ethel. So her friend Ethel lives in Virginia on a farm, and they have like another kind of bunkhouse that they fix up, and Barb goes there to live as well. And she just kind of wants to have a little bit of a change. And so she goes and she lives in Virginia for a couple of years. But it's not just an easy break with her family. There is like a really big blow up, and because her family is just not really being supportive, and they're just not really understanding what she experienced there, and they just really want her to forget about it and meet a man, I'm assuming, and get married and get on with her life. But of course, it's hard to do, and especially when you're dealing with so much trauma and PTSD and you're not able to get help for it. So she kind of like has a break from her family and she goes to Virginia. And while she's there, Barb and Ethel take her to, they go to like a rally in Washington, where she meets this psychiatrist, I think he is. His name is Henry. He's a little bit older, but they have just like a little bit of a connection. And she gets word that her mother has had a stroke. So she goes back to California, and she starts to rebuild a little bit of those relationships with her parents at that time. And she uses it as an opportunity while she's there to rebuild those relationships. And she helps her mother recover from the stroke. She's kind of really instrumental, and she's really there for her mother. So her father buys this little cottage that he basically gives to her to live in. And that's kind of like a testament to how the relationships are really kind of growing and repairing during this time. And while she's there, she starts to do really good. So she gets another job and she's living in this cottage on her own, still kind of experiencing, of course, a lot of the trauma. But during this time, she feels like she's dealing with it a lot better. And then lo and behold, she meets Henry again. And they kind of start to develop a bit of a relationship. It's not what she felt with Rye or even with Jamie, but it's a very comfortable relationship. So she pursues it, and they have like they get into like a really nice, comfortable sort of relationship. And then she finds herself pregnant with his baby. And when she tells him, he immediately proposes to her. And she accepts. Once again, even though she doesn't feel that deep love that she felt with Rye, it's a very comfortable relationship. And of course, her family, her parents, are very happy about it because they feel like, okay, this is what you should be doing. You should be getting married and having kids. And of course, he's a doctor, so they're really excited about that. At this time as well, they get word that the Vietnam War is now finally finished. The war is over. Troops are going to start coming home. POWs are coming home. Men who are missing in action are coming home. So a few days or weeks or whatever it is down the line, she is watching the newscast of all of these POWs coming home. And who gets off one of the planes but Rye? And she immediately notices him. But now, what is she going to do? She's pregnant with another man's baby. She's engaged. She's literally days away from getting married to Henry. But she decides, I am going to go meet his plane when it lands in California. And that's what she does. So she goes to the airfield, and she is standing there when he gets off of the plane. And what happens when he gets off? But she sees him walk over to another woman and a young child, a young girl. So it turns out that he is married and he has a daughter. So this is just another blow to her as she's dealing with, all of the things from being in the war. And so all of this stress causes her to wind up in the hospital, and she has a miscarriage. But she kind of looks at it as an opportunity to basically tell Henry that, I don't really love you. So she realizes this through having this miscarriage. And so she's honest with him, and she tells him, like, I don't really love you. And, this relationship is not going to work out for us. So they break up. When she's in the hospital, her mother kind of shares with her that she also had a miscarriage as well. So they kind of bond a little bit on that. And her mother starts to kind of give her and it kind of shares with her that, I'm taking these prescription sleeping pills, and she starts to give her some of those to help her sleep. After she's out of the hospital, she tries to continue on with her life. And one day she goes to the beach that's near her house, and she sees Rye with his wife and his daughter. And she decides to follow them. So she gets in her car and she follows them to their house. And she sees him kind of look over, and she doesn't know if he saw her. So she hops in her car and she immediately goes away. In her mind, she's thinking, well, he knows where I live. She's kind of expecting a telephone call, but a phone call never comes. But one day she does get a knock on the door. And when she opens it, it is Rye standing there. And he basically says to her, I saw you that day. Why did you follow me home? If you followed me, you probably still love me. And then she says to him, but you lied to me. You're married. You have a child. And his response to that is, I met her just before I got deployed. We quickly got married. She had our daughter when I was in Vietnam. This is the first time that I have met her. But I feel more for you. Like I don't feel for her the way that I feel for you. So despite her, best intentions, and despite, everything else, she does enter into a relationship with him, even though he is already married. And I guess he's kind of like really leading her to believe that he is going to leave his wife because he really feels for her more than he feels for his wife. And so she continues on, but she knows that it's the wrong thing because they can't even tell anybody. And all of this is just kind of feeding a lot into the negativity that she's feeling with her mental state. So she tries to break it off with Rye a couple of times, but it doesn't really work. There's just some kind of thing that she needs from him that it's just really difficult to break free from this really bad toxic relationship. And even though he proposes to her as well, he's married, but I guess she kind of feels like he's going to leave his wife for me. But that never happens. And she's really stuck in this really bad cycle as well of prescription sleeping pills, prescription uppers to wake her up during the day, some alcohol as well. But one day while she's at the hospital, she sees kind of this news conference going on. Not really a news conference, but it's like the media is there, and she hears Rye's name. And she asks somebody what's going on. And they tell her that his wife is in the hospital. So she finds out the floor that his wife is on, and she goes there. And she sees that his wife has had another baby. So now she has had a boy, and he now has a son. And this is when she really realizes that he is still, there's obviously a close relationship that he has with his wife, and he is never going to leave her for me. And he has now just lied to me again. And so she finally does break it off with him. And through all of this additional trauma that she's experiencing, one night she drives under the influence, and she gets into a really bad car accident. She totals her car, hits a pedestrian, injures him really bad, and almost kills him. So she winds up in the hospital, with a DUI charge, which I believe her dad is able to kind of like get swept under the rug a little bit. So she really has to go into treatment. And so they do kind of put her into this treatment facility. And that's where she just starts to get a little bit of the help that she needs. And while she's there, she meets up with Henry again. And he is, because it is his treatment facility that he kind of got off the ground. But this time he is now engaged to somebody else. But she's okay with it because she feels like they weren't really a good match and they weren't really meant to be. The person that he is with now seems to suit him a lot more. So, Henry's kind of out of the question at this point. So at this point, we're kind of reaching a little bit more toward the end of the book. So she decides to get out of California. Barb comes to be with her, and they decide to just drive. And to get out of California, she tells her parents, I'm leaving. Like, I need to leave. And so they just drive. And they drive through California. They drive through Oregon. They drive through Washington State. So she winds up in Montana. And she finds a farm. She comes across this farm that is for sale. And she buys it. And this is where she decides that she wants to set up a treatment center for women who were in the Vietnam War and who have a lot of PTSD and trauma from being in the war. She feels like when she went to Ethel's farm in Virginia, being around the horses and really kind of helped her. And that's kind of the type of treatment center that she sets up in Montana. So years later, in Washington, D.C., they are unveiling a war memorial statue to the veterans of the Vietnam War. And she decides, along with her friends, that they're going to go to this. And the final twist of the story is that while she is there, she sees Jamie, the doctor that she first met when she first went to Vietnam and who she kind of had feelings for but didn't pursue those feelings. He did not die, and he is now divorced. And it's kind of left open-ended at the end of whether you think they kind of start up a relationship again. So that brings us to the end of the story. So that was a long one. It's the first time I've ever done anything like this before, really kind of recount all of the plot points through a story. I don't know if I got everything exactly in order, but that's the basic storyline of what happens. I really enjoyed this book. It really grabbed me right from the beginning. And I think I read it in like 5 or 6 days, which is fast for me. And I just really wanted to read. Like, I wasn't forcing myself to read. I wasn't trying to make time to read. I just really wanted to read all the time because I wanted to find out what was going to happen. So I really enjoyed this book. On Goodreads, I gave it a 4. It's one of those kinds of books that really makes you think, which is great. I love reading books like that. That's one of the parts of reading is, especially fiction. Like, you can read nonfiction to learn things if that's your thing, but you can also read nonfiction to learn things when something is like a historical fiction, because there's a lot of like actual historical plot points that happen in this book. So it really makes you think. As someone so I wasn't alive during the time of the Vietnam War, and I'm not American, I'm Canadian. So we don't really learn a lot about the Vietnam War. We don't hear a lot about it because Canada was not officially involved in it, even though through some of my research, I did find out that there were some Canadians who signed up to go, and our government did provide some assistance in some ways to the war effort, but we were not officially in the war. So we don't learn about it as much. What I know about it is just from watching movies and what you hear through TV shows and, just whatever you learn, right? But so we don't officially learn a lot about it. But it's, I really enjoyed it. For me, I kind of feel like I would have liked to see a little bit of a romance that works out for her, if that makes sense. But that's just kind of the way that I am. I'm a bit of a romantic. So when I read a story, I kind of want there to be a bit of a romantic ending. And I feel like this book really does a good job of showing the trauma that veterans can go through. And it really made me think about that. In this story, we're seeing a character who is kind of from a well-to-do family. So when she comes back, at least she has that financial support. Whereas when you think about the veterans coming back who did not have that and do not have that, a lot of veterans come home, especially at that time. I know specifically in this story, the author makes a point to mention that a lot of the soldiers were actually getting addicted to different types of drugs because it's one of the ways you cope, especially in a situation like being in a war and being in a war zone. It's one of the ways you cope is with alcohol and drugs, and they come back addicted to drugs and they have no services and no access to help. And then especially when you don't have a family that can financially help you out, that makes it additionally. So you really see how a lot of these Vietnam veterans were winding up on the streets and winding up homeless and that sort of thing because of all of those circumstances. And like I said, with this story, we're seeing it through the eyes of a girl who has that family support. But what are those people who don't, right? And so that's kind of what it got me thinking about. But overall, I really enjoyed this book. It's one of the most enjoyable books that I've read all of this year. So I would really like to know what you thought about it. Let me know in the comments what you thought about this book. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? What are your thoughts on it? So I guess I better wrap this one up. It's been a really long one, but I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to see more videos that are similar to this, don't forget to subscribe. And I will see you very soon in another video.